Hello, am I audible? Okay, so hi, welcome to the second tutorial for the course Forests and their Management. And as you know, this course is offered by Dr. Ankur Awadhiya, and I am Geetika Agarwal. I am a PhD scholar at the Center for Ecological Sciences in IIC Bangalore. And yeah, today I'll be taking this tutorial. And let's try and keep it interactive. You can ask me questions anywhere in between you want. I'll be mostly covering the contents of the second week. And I've also tried to keep the presentation interactive so that you guys can tell me about what you learned during the week and we can discuss the concepts. Okay. So moving on, this week mostly talked about silviculture, and then we talked about a little bit about ecological succession, and we discussed plant growth and what are different plant growth hormones, and uh, what are different plant growth hormones, and what are the nutrients that plant requires. Not growth hormones, but yeah, the nutrients that plants require. So yeah, can you guys tell me what is silviculture? What do we understand by silviculture? You can either unmute yourself or you can type it out in the chat box, whatever suits you. Okay. Anyway, so silviculture basically is the art and science of cultivating forest crop. तो फॉरेस्ट क्रॉप्स को कैसे कल्टीवेट करना चाहिए in order to get the maximum amount of benefits out of that forest land, और वो benefits क्या है, that depends on what is your objective in maintaining that forest land. But the art and science of cultivating forest crop is basically silviculture. It comes from the words silva and culture, जो हमने last tutorial में discuss किया था. Silva means wood and culture means cultivation, and so basically wood cultivation becomes silviculture. ठीक है. Then moving on to silvics. So what is silvics? Do you guys know what is silvics? Or would you like to take a guess? Now that you know what is silviculture, you can take a guess on what is silvics. Okay, so as the term suggests, just like we use civics, basically similarly there is silvics, and silvics is the study that goes behind silviculture. So to perform silviculture, you need to have some knowledge about the forest, right? and about the plants that grow there, about the soil that is present there. So basically, that knowledge or that study that's required to carry out silviculture is comes under the field of silvics. So in Silvics, हम क्या पढ़ते हैं? What we study is basically what is the life history of the trees that are present in the area of, or in general of the plants that are present in the area, and what are the general features of the forest crop with respect to environmental factors. तो हम ये देखना चाह रहे हैं कि वहाँ पे कैसे का environment है, what is the climate, what is the amount of sunlight that is being received, what is the soil type, and what is the quality of the soil, how what is the amount of rainfall. So what are these different environmental factors, what is temperature, and then we would try and relate it to what kind of plants we find there, and what is the life history of the plants, basically at what age the seedling matures, or when does the tree achieves maturity, yeah, cub it becomes like a proper woody tree which can be harvested for its timber, these things. That is called silvics. Okay, and the next thing is silvicultural practices. So silviculture is a thing, and the practices under silviculture basically are called silvicultural practices. And ये वो individual treatments है which can be applied to the forest strands in order to maintain them and to enhance their utility. सो एज आई सेड, सिल्वीकल्चर का मेन गोल है कि हम एनहांस करना चाह रहे हैं उस फॉरेस्ट लैंड की यूटिलिटी, कि हाउ इम्पॉर्टेंट, सॉरी, हाउ utilizable, how useful is that area to us, depending on whatever is our objective. Our objective could be that we want to get the maximum amount of timber of the area. Objective could be we want to support a high amount of biodiversity. हमें बहुत सारे animals, plants चाहिए उस area में. That could be one of the goals. Goal could be we want to increase the amount of ecotourism. So maybe we want to make it looking more aesthetic. या फिर गोल कुड बी कि हमें सबसे ज़्यादा नॉन फॉरेस्ट नॉन टिम्बर फॉरेस्ट प्रोड्यूस चाहिए. सो इट कुड बी समथिंग लाइक दैट. सो बेस्ड ऑन दीज डिफरेंट गोल्स, how to maintain and how to enhance the utility of the forest land that we have. So that comes under silviculture, and silvicultural practices are all the treatments you apply to the forest. So basically, यहाँ पे there are some treatments being applied. They are in this image. You can see that they are tending the stand. They're putting, this guy is putting some sort of a spray. Maybe it could be a pesticide, or could be some sort of a maintenance practice in which they want to tend the stand that they're working on. And here, when the stand matures, when the trees mature, then they are harvesting it. After harvesting the trees, because now the land is again available for regrowth or planting again, then this person here is planting seedlings again. So these are different silvicultural practices. Okay. Moving on to what are the objectives of silviculture. So can you guys take a guess on what are the objectives of silviculture? वैसे तो I just gave away the answer in the previous slide itself a little bit. But would you guys want to take some guesses on what could be the different objectives of silviculture? If we say you have a land, you have a forest on that, and what could be different things that you want from that forest? Any guesses? You can unmute yourself or you can type it out in the chat box. What could be the different objectives behind silviculture? Anything? Okay. So as I said in the previous slide also, silviculture के बहुत सारे objectives हो सकते हैं. It could be that I want to increase the quality of timber in my forest. So maybe I will plant trees that are of high economic value, yeah, which receive a high amount of money if I sell the timber of that particular plant. So I want to produce a high quality timber. I want to maximize the amount of production. I want to get the maximum amount of timber that I can from the land that I have. That could be one of the other objectives. It could be that I want to produce species which are of high economic value. These could be timber or non-timber species. For example, मेरा coffee plantation है. I want to increase the amount of coffee beans that come out of that area. Or I want to have, say, medicinal plants in that area. Anything. So I want to plant species which are going to give me back high economic value. That could be another objective. There could be a third thing, जैसे मैंने बोला था earlier, just like I said in the previous slide. I want to create a wildlife habitat basically. I want to create an area which has a high biodiversity. It supports a large number of plants and animals and bird life or insects, snakes, anything. So basically, whatever I'm interested in, I want to have a good wildlife in that area. So that could be a silvicultural objective. And then another objective could be carbon sequestration. I want to maximize the amount of carbon that can get sequestered in the particular forest. So ho sakta hai, because these days we have a lot of pollution, we have a lot of carbon dioxide in the air. So it's entirely possible that we want to have a stand of forest, just undisturbed forest, but we want to have such trees which can have the maximum amount of carbon sequestered in their biomass. So basically, if we want carbon sequestration is our main goal, then we would like to plant that area with trees which can have a large and which can fastly take up carbon and which can keep a lot of carbon in their biomass. So which can store a large amount of carbon. So that is basically carbon sequestration. It will lead to, cleaning up of your air and of your environment, and prevent or like control the amount of pollution that's present in that area. Then it could be protection and maintenance of the site for intangible returns. We're trying to protect this site. We have this area with a very nice forest. It's a very quaint, serene place, and we just want to maintain this site for now for some intangible returns that we might get in the future. Basically, one of the intangible returns, like we talked about in last class, was like bequest value. Ki we want to just leave this land to be available for use for the future generations. So maybe that is one of the returns we want. Or maybe it could be that sometime in the future we want to, set up like a forest camp in this area, and we want to have ecotourism in this area. Another thing could be I want to conduct research. So basically, I want to have an undisturbed forest land so that some people can come and conduct research. For example, people like us, people who are researchers, like I study birds, so I need to go to the forest and look at the particular species that I'm interested in and study those species. If somebody is studying mammals, somebody is studying rodents, snakes, anything like that, because these things will only be present in the forest. Like if you want to study their native or wild habitat, they'll be present in the forest. So maybe the government wants to maintain that area entirely undisturbed, like a reserved forest, in order to have these returns in the future, right? So these could be some of the objectives of silviculture. Another thing could be to reduce the rotation age. So this again comes back to the is related to the objective of extracting wood, extracting timber from the forest. So reduction of rotation age means ki I want to reduce the difference in time which it takes for the trees to mature. So I मुझे ऐसे trees plant करने हैं which in 50 years I can basically cut them off and I can put up a new forest there. So basically, if there is a tree which matures, say, in 100 years, and there's a tree that matures or becomes useful to you in sense of timber in, say, 80 years, you would want to plant the trees that mature in 80 years because that was going to reduce the rotation age. You can then start planting the new trees after 80 years. You don't have to wait for those 20 years, right? So these could be some of your silvicultural objectives. Now, humans have an impact on forest. So, can you tell me how humans have an impact on forest and how can this impact be measured or how can it be assessed? Can anybody take a guess on that? Or does anybody already know how do you measure the impact that humans have on forests? If you would have watched the week's lectures or gone through anything, you would know about this. Anybody? Like what? Okay, can you just give me a general answer to how do humans impact forests? This, so I think most of you should know. That's basic. Like, how do you think we impact forests? What are the different ways humans can impact forests and like, or the environment in general? Anybody would like to take a guess? You can unmute yourself or you can type it out in the chat box. Okay. Okay, I thought that was a pretty basic question, but anyway, moving on. So, to measure a human impact on forests, we basically have this equation which says I is equal to P into A into T, where I is the environmental impact that we are having. P is the population pressure or the population size that's present in that area or near that forest, whichever we're talking about. A is the affluence. Affluence basically is per capita consumption of resources or per capita need for resources. So, how many resources are needed, say, per individual? If you're talking about population size in terms of numbers of individual, then how much resources are required by one single individual? And then there's T, which is technology, which says what is the impact, how much ability do we have to extract these resources, and how much impact can per unit consumption have on the forest. So, how much are we destroying the forests per unit consumption of the resources, right? So, this is a very important equation of how to measure human impact on forests. And as you can see in this image, if you have a small population, say if you have a small family of three which live in this small house and they have limited technology, then the impact will be less. So, if, for example, you have, we'll come to that later when we talk about stages of silviculture, but basically, okay, yeah, somebody has answered. Threats include illegal and unsustainable logging, overharvesting of wood for fuel and charcoal, small scale farming, hunting, forest fires, and pests and diseases. Very good, Sonal. That's a correct answer, or like a very nice answer. Basically, yeah, we have different threats. We can be logging the forests, which could be very well done in an unsustainable way if our needs is more than what the forests can sustain. We could be over harvesting wood, correct, and there could be how, I don't know how small scale farming is gonna, have a negative impact on the forest. But yeah, hunting, forest fires which could be started by some human causes, and pests and diseases, if they're spread by us, then yes, they could be an impact on forests. So anyway, so what we were discussing was, as any of these factors increases, if the population size increases, and consequently the need for resources will increase if there's a higher population, and eventually if the population is increasing, the technology will increase in that area because people will find out ways to do things or to extract resources in a better manner, and then that is going to lead to an increase in the impact that we have on the forests. Okay, so next we come to the um, development of silviculture. How has silviculture developed over the history, or what is the history of silviculture? How has silviculture developed over the ages? First of all, we start with the Aboriginal society, then we go to modernization, and then we go to a modern society. And this silvicultural cycle can also, or this silvicultural history can also go into a cyclical manner. So, what happens when we talk about an Aboriginal society? It's basically talking about, say, a certain number of people which live in the forest and they live in harmony with the forest. They are in lesser numbers because they have lesser resources to sustain themselves. So, they live. So, the population size, first of all, is in control. So, we don't have high numbers of individuals. Then, when you come to affluence, their affluence is also low because they live in the forest and they don't like over as. Mentioned in the comment also, they're not over harvesting anything that they don't require. They're not cutting up a lot of wood, they're just taking the little bit amount that they might require. And more or less they did not have a lot of technology. So in the olden times when there were Aboriginal societies like in Australia or in places in some of the rural areas or in some of the remote areas of India or Africa or South America. So the tribes were living in harmony with the forests and they were not destroying much of the area. The As I said, population sizes were in control, the requirements were in control, the technology was not so well developed that they could destroy an entire forest. So they did not have a large impact on the forests near them. So they did not really require a lot of conservation. Those forests were inherently conserved because nobody was destroying them in the first place to require some amount of conservation. Okay. And more or less, some amount of conservation happened because they would not they would actually get attached with certain trees. For example, if there are some fruiting trees, some things that they're getting food out of, or they're getting fodder, or they are worshipping some trees, so they'll be attached to these trees, and they'll definitely not cut them down because they have certain sentimental values attached to them. So in this way, the forest stayed conserved and not much conservation was required, not much scientific intervention was required at this point. Then stage two came in, there was modernization. As numbers of people increased, for example, um, so numbers of people increased, their demands increased, the affluence increased, and people started, using wood for different things. They started cutting down timber to make houses, or cutting down woods to make ships, things like that, to make horse carts, different things. So that requirement per capita increased from the forests, and more forests started getting cut up, and the technology also increased. As I said, if there is ships, then they can transport wood. If there is wagons, they can take wood from the jungle to the city, which can be used for different purposes, things like that. So the technology also increased over time and modernization came in. But at this point also, the conservation is not much required, because even if it was required, the demands could be met because the uh, planet was not so explored, and people there was still a lot of unexplored forest area which could be occupied. For example, if there's a society, if there's a community living here and they've exploited their forest, they could still expand their area more, and now use the further, which is like the forest which is away from them. They can still capture that forest and start using the wood or the resources in that forest. So that's the stage of modernization. And mostly Roman Empire or British Empire, these things come in that forest. Basically, they started expanding. For example, the Britishers also started expanding into other parts of the world in order to exploit their forests or their resources, right? Then comes in the modern society. So what happens in the modern society is that now the population size has increased way too much. The affluence is too high, that they are extracting a lot of resources from the forest. Technology is super advanced, so they can extract these resources in a very quick manner, in a very fast fashion. And because of this, the impact is very high, and because of this high impact, now conservation becomes very important. It becomes imminent, it becomes like the important topic of the day. And there is now scientific intervention that is required at this point. You need to study the forests and then start conserving them in some manner. So that is when silviculture as a scientific practice came into play. And this is what is happening right now, and what has been happening since the 19th century um, in most parts of the world, basically. Okay, so I hope this history of silviculture is more or less clear to people. And there was one example of how silviculture or the history could be cyclical, or these three stages could be cyclical, in the sense that earlier, for example, India had a lot of kings around, and all of them have done most of their things. So maybe these kings in their empire also had a time when the resources were not required so much, and they did not, and the forests more or less stayed conserved because they did not go and harm the forests. Eventually, when technology improved, maybe they also started harvesting the forests way more than required. But then, because they are rural rulers, they could go and capture out more land. So they would venture out and they'd capture more and more area, and so they got more forests into their what do you call it, under their rule in their empire. And then eventually, when the forest started declining, they would think, oh yeah, we should now start conserving forests, and they would think about that. But even if they were doing this, because of the external forces, for example, because at once, even when we had very established empires of, say, the Mughals or the Mauryas, or people like that, still when the Britishers came, they came in with the motive of extracting resources from Indian forests, of, like, completely destroying, or for lack of a better word, completely destroying the local resources, because they don't care about what resources we have or we don't. They mostly wanted to take resources for themselves. So they came in with that again, and so we went back to the modernization era, where we are like extracting resources in an unsustainable or an uncontrolled fashion. Okay, so these are the different stages of silviculture, and how we have reached today where we are scientifically practicing silviculture. Then there are some structural objectives one could have for their forests. For example, the government could have for the forest, or somebody who's a private owner of a forest land, he or she could have for their forests, right? Some structural objectives, one of them could be age class structure. So, for example, I have a forest land and I want to maintain a certain age class structure in that forest. If my goal for this forest is just to have wildlife and to maintain a high amount of biodiversity, then I don't really require to maintain any age class. But if my motive is to maintain a particular age of the maximum amount of trees in that forest, for example, I want that 80% of my trees should always be in a mature state, then I will have a certain way of maintaining that forest in order to have this structural age class for my forest. For example, I could divide my forest into equal amount of parts, and I could start planting them at different times so that different parts of the land reach maturity at different time. So even if one part is mature and is getting harvested, there is still another part which is yet to reach maturity. So I will always have a certain stand of trees in my forest, and there will never going to be like a completely barren land or a completely fallow land which does not have any particular forest. So that is somehow maintaining the age class structure. Or I could be wanting to have a monoculture where all the trees are of the same age. So basically, I will clear the land and I will plant it with an equal aged trees, and then they will all mature at the same time, and then I can cut them up together and then start my next forest in that area. So that's about maintaining the age class. Then there's site occupancy and preferred species mixture. So what kind of species do I want in my area? Do I want a highly biodiverse forest, or do I want a monoculture? What is my goal for this forest basically? And what is the site occupancy? How much of the area do I want occupied? Then there is a spatial distribution of trees. Do I want my trees to be clumped in the entire forest land, or do I want them to be uniformly distributed, equally spaced out in that land? Right? And then there could be something like creation and maintenance of desirable attributes. So I could have some attributes, like I said, I could want like a very biodiverse forest, or a lot of plants, a lot of animals, a lot of herbivores in the forest. So that could be kept in mind for maintaining the forest. If I want a lot of herbivores, I will keep a lot more grasses in the forest. If I want a lot of, say, arboreal species, I would keep a lot more trees in the area so that they can climb on these trees and have their things. If I want a lot more woodpeckers, then I would have trees which have hollows in them so that they can nest and all of that. So this could be basically different desirable attributes I could have. Okay, so that's about the structural objectives for the forest. Silviculture in itself is related to many of the basic fields in forestry. So we're going to discuss some of these basic fields, but if somebody already has an idea, you can tell me what are the different fields in forestry that silviculture is related closely to. These different topics or different fields in forestry, which are important to understand silviculture, or silviculture is important to understand them basically. They go hand in hand. Does anybody have any idea of what I'm talking about? Okay, so I will move on. So, one is about protecting the forest, forest protection, which is another branch of forestry, which is mostly concerned with us trying to prevent or trying to control the amount of damage that is being caused to the forest, right? So, silviculture becomes important even when we're trying to protect the forests. So, um, very simply, it's basically the branch of forestry which involves the activities that are trying to prevent the amount of damage caused to the forests. Another thing is mensuration, as the term suggests, and as we discussed in the last week, it's basically the art and science of measuring the forests and providing quantifiable information about the trees and about the plants in the forest and different things. So we could be talking about what is the age class of different trees, what is the girth of the trees, what is the height of of the canopy, these different things. So that comes under forest mensuration. What is the density of trees? These things. Then utilization. If you're talking about forest utilization, that's another field in which we talk about how do you harvest the forest produce, how do you dispose of some of this, and how do you use the different forest produce. So what technology or what mechanisms can I use to harvest the forest produce. And there could be different ways of harvesting the same thing depending on what we are trying to do with it. So if you're trying to cut a tree for firewood, there'll be a different way you will take out the wood from the tree. If you want to do it for timber, there'll be a different way. If you want to do it for making plywood, there'll be a different way. So how do you harvest the forest produce and how do you use it basically? Then there could be forest management, which we discussed last week again. It's basically the application of scientific, technical, and economic principles of forestry. So there are these three different principles that come under forestry: a scientific approach, a technical approach, and a more economic approach. Scientific approach basically talks about the science that goes behind forest management. Technical, as I said, okay, yeah, it is. So Sonal says that it's crucial for sustainable forest management, ensuring a continuous supply of timber while protecting biodiversity, improving soil health, and sequestering carbon to combat climate change. So, can I know what this is the answer of? Uh, what is crucial? Silviculture. Are you talking about silviculture in your answer? That it's crucial for sustainable management? Okay, anyway, yeah, if you're talking about silviculture for being crucial for forest management and ensuring a supply of timber while protecting biodiversity, then you're correct. Basically, it could help us do all of those depending on what our objective is for the forest that we're talking about, right? So in forest management, we're basically trying to have a practical application of these different principles that go behind in forestry, and depending again on our objective for the forest. And then we talk about economics. Economics is basically studying the forests in the sense thinking about forests as productive assets. So basically, we're thinking about forest in the sense of how much money can we get out of this forest, how much economic benefit can we get out of this forest. So basically, we're not studying forests, for example, in terms of their biodiversity or in terms of conservation or in terms of the animals that inhabit it, but we're thinking of it as productive assets, how much produce we can get out of the forest. So that comes under the forest economics. Okay. So these are the five different fields of forestry that silviculture is very closely related to: protection, mensuration, utilization, management, and economics. Okay, moving on to what factors can regulate the forests. So, can you guys tell me two broad categories in which the factors that regulate the forests can be divided into? So, two broad categories that basically have an impact on forests or any ecosystem for that matter. Can you take a guess on what are the two broad categories of factors that can regulate forests and ecosystems? If not broad categories, you can basically think about individual factors. If something comes to your mind, what can regulate the forests or what can be having an impact on forests? Okay. Anyway, so very basically talking, very simplistically talking, two broad categories of factors that can regulate an ecosystem or a forest, as an example, are basically abiotic and biotic factors, which is something which you all might have learned in your high schools. And abiotic factors basically include very general features like soil quality, water, air, sunlight. And biotic factors basically include the presence of animals, the presence of plants, and the interactions between different organisms, how different organisms are interacting with each other, and how that regulates the forests and the forest stand that we're talking about. Right? So, the factors that regulate forests can be divided into abiotic, biotic factors, which basically impact not just forests, but everything on the planet. And there are different layers of the forest which we discussed even in the last tutorial session. So, would anybody like to take a guess on what are these different layers of the forests? What is the lowermost layer of the forest called? Forest floor. Very nice. So basically, the forest floor is the lowermost layer, which is dark, humid. It hosts a lot of insects and many uh, animals as well. And you see that the forest floor is mostly covered with a lot of dead and decomposing leaves and decomposing bodies of animals that have been killed. It has a lot of it has very little amount of sunlight that reaches the forest floor if you're talking about, say, a dense forest or like a tropical evergreen kind of a forest. And it hosts a lot of these what do you call them, detritivores, and a lot of these worms and insects which stay in the lower layers. And there are some grasses which are shade tolerant, so that's the and yeah, very nice. It's forest floor, understory, canopy, and emergent layer. Correct. The emergent layers: tallest trees, canopy, dense leaf roof; understory, young trees, shrubs, shade tolerant plants; and the forest floor, decomposing matter. Correct. So you both are correct. Basically, that's the four different layers of forest. Forest floor, as I said, is the lowermost layer, mostly comprises of dead organic matter. A lot of tree leaves keep falling, a lot of dead foliage, and even dead animals are present on the forest floor. And it's quite humid and it's quite dark here. Then, when you go to the understory, understory consists of young trees and young herbs or trees of lower height. These are mostly shade tolerant because through the canopy, not a lot of sunlight can penetrate if you're talking about a dense forest. So, and these are shade tolerant plants which do not require a lot of sunlight. Canopy layer is the thickest layer. It's the one continuous layer of trees of equal height that spans the forest. And these are mostly plants which are light demanders. They need a lot of light to sustain themselves, and that is why they form the canopy layer. And there are some plants here and there which form the emergent layer. These are trees that actually even outgrow the canopy, even higher than the canopy, but they're not all of them are like they're not present in a continuous layer, because then that would be the canopy height. These are trees that here and there, some few trees in the forest that go beyond the canopy height, and they form the tallest trees. And these mostly include some birds, some insects. It's written that no animals live here, but actually, even in the emergent layer, you can find arboreal animals such as, say, some giant squirrels, or you can find mammals. At least in the forests that I roam around in, I usually see the Malabar giant squirrel in the highest, even in the highest trees. And but yeah, basically, you see a lot of birds, you see minivets, you see drongos in the highest trees, and of course, insects will be there. In the canopy layer, you see a lot of arboreal animals. You see a lot of, as I said, squirrels, a lot of langurs, monkeys, macaques, and you see a lot of lorises, these different things. In the understory, again, in all of these layers, you see birds. As I work on birds, we see birds in all of these layers. There's just different species that occupy different layers in the forest. Understory usually, apart from birds, has a lot of insects, and again, a lot of these arboreal animals. But because in the understory the trees are not that strong, they're still young trees, and they're herbs, so they cannot like support the weight of the heavier animals. But you do see a lot of lizards and snakes and everything in the understory layer. And in the forest floor, again, you will have, as I said, you'll again have a lot of lizards. You'll have a lot of walking animals like mammals, big mammals that walk around, but they can actually be considered forest floor and understory because they have some height, right? So that's the composition of the forest and different layers of plants and what kind of organisms you can expect to find there. Then in the lectures we talk about growth in plants. So can you tell me two major phenomena or two major processes that are important for understanding the growth of plants? What are two major phenomena that happen almost all of the time in plants, and how are they related to the growth of plants? Photosynthesis, yes, and respiration. Yeah. So, photosynthesis, as you might all be aware of, is basically the process by which plants fix sunlight, and they convert carbon dioxide and oxygen and water into oxygen and carbohydrates, right? So that's the way in which they fix carbon dioxide, and also they use sunlight for this process. And then there's respiration, just like all of us heterotrophs. Similarly, plants also almost all of the time during the day they and during the night they perform respiration. And respiration basically involves breaking down carbohydrates by oxidizing them using oxygen and carbohydrates, and then breaking them down into carbon dioxide, water, and energy, right? And for this you do not require sunlight. So these are two different processes, and the ratio of these two processes, photosynthesis to respiration, tells us about growth. If a plant has high amount of photosynthesis compared to respiration, then it's growing and it's accumulating a lot more biomass, because it's converting a lot of carbon dioxide into carbohydrates, and it's fixing and keeping it into its biomass, so it's growing like that. But not a lot of it is getting broken down and released back into the environment. But if respiration is higher than photosynthesis, then maybe that plant is not growing, or it's probably on the verge of senescence in that matter, right? So that's about growth. Then we come to the different productivities. So can anybody tell me what is the gross primary productivity? So there's different productivities that are related to plants. One of them is gross primary productivity. One of them is net primary productivity. So can you guys tell me what is the difference between gross primary productivity and net primary productivity? Anybody? Yeah. So the total amount of biomass that is produced during photosynthesis is would be gross primary production, and the total amount of biomass produced during photosynthesis per unit time would be gross primary productivity, right? So the amount of energy or the amount of carbon that is fixed via photosynthesis per unit time is basically gross primary productivity. And net primary productivity is actually the amount of energy which is lost via respiration per unit time. So that's the net primary productivity. And when you look at the relationship between gross and net primary productivity, basically NPP is GPP minus R. So there is some gross primary productivity, out of which um, some of the energy which is used by cellular work is lost as under respiration, and some of the energy or carbon which stays stored even after that loss is called net primary productivity, and that is GPP minus R. Total rate at which ecosystems capture and store carbon or biomass by photosynthesis by autotrophs over a specific time. Yeah, so that is correct. So basically, net primary productivity is gross minus the amount that is lost in respiration. So I think my definition that's in the slide is slightly wrong. It should be gross minus the amount of energy or carbon which is lost via respiration. So this line here I will correct before I send you guys the slides. Okay. So basically, net primary productivity is gross primary productivity minus respiration. And then there's something called compensation point. So do you guys know what is compensation point? So compensation point basically is the point at which, yeah, the point of equilibrium when photosynthesis and respiration become equal to each other. So when the net primary productivity is zero, and equilibrium point for plants when photosynthesis is equal to respiration, right? So that is all about GPP, NPP, and compensation point. Here, this is the correct NPP definition. This I will alter before I send you guys. Anyway, so about compensation points. So during the day, as you can see in this curve, during the time of the day, respiration happens almost all throughout the day. in even in a plant. Okay, so this is like a flat, almost like a flattish line for respiration, even though in the later hours when the sun is low, the respiration is higher during at night a little bit, right? And then in the day not so much. And when it comes to photosynthesis, because it is a light dependent process, it starts around 6:37 when the sun rises, and it starts increasing in amount, and it peaks when the sun is maximum, when the sun is like at the strongest, when the incident light is the strongest, and then it goes down by the amount of by the time of sunset, right? So there are these 2 points during the day at which the rate of respiration is equal to the rate of photosynthesis, and these are known as compensation points during the day for um, a particular plant. Okay, so moving on to efficiency of GPP and efficiency of NPP. Basically, it's a similar concept. Efficiency is basically the energy fixed either by gross primary productivity or by net primary productivity, and then it's divided by the amount of energy that was present in the incident sunlight. So, how much energy was present in the incident sunlight? If that is in the denominator, and the amount of energy that is fixed by either of these processes, then that becomes the efficiency of that particular productivity. Okay, then there's this phenomena in which, according to which, sorry, there's this formula according to which NPP is equal to APAR into LUE. Can anybody tell me what is APAR and what is LUE? What are these two random terms that have been thrown on the screen? What is APAR and what is LUE? So APAR is absorbed photosynthetically active radiation. You're correct. And what is LUE? It's light use efficiency. Very nice. So basically, these two terms mean absorbed photosynthetically active radiation. So, how much radiation out of the incident sunlight is actually photosynthetically active, and how much of this is absorbed? So, the absorbed synthetically active radiation would be APAR, and it's measured as megajoules per meter square per time. So, how much megajoules of energy is being or radiation is being absorbed per meter square of the area of the plant and per unit time? And then you talk about light use efficiency. So, how efficiently is the plant using this light? How much grams of carbon is getting fixed, or kilograms, depending on whatever carbon is getting fixed per megajoules of energy or radiation that is being absorbed. And then there is NPP, which when you multiply these two units, you will see that the unit for NPP will be grams or kilograms of carbon per meter square per time, right? And as discussed in the lecture, these NPP can actually be assessed either by using even by using satellites or by using computer programming. And here you can see a map of the world in which you see regions which have a high amount of net primary productivity are marked in blue. Regions which have almost an average amount or a low amount are marked, sorry, average amount are marked in green and low amount are marked in red. So here you see that in these rainforests, some here in the Amazon and here in Africa, you find a high amount of primary productivity. And in other areas, like in some parts of India, you get very low primary productivity. These are the drier zones of India, and like in these areas with a lot of snow, and in the Antarctics or in the poles, you almost have no primary productivity because there's no plants present in these areas. Then we're talking about factors that affect productivity. So when we talk about what are the different factors that can affect the productivity of a plant, so can you guys tell me what are the different factors that might affect the productivity of plants? So there are seven different factors. Yeah, it depends on seven variables, correct? Latitude, yeah. So what is the concentration? How much carbon dioxide is present there, and what is the nutrition? Solar constant, cloudiness, dust, and water. Yeah. So you're correct. So one of them is solar constant, which is actually the average amount of electromagnetic radiation or the average amount of sunlight that reaches per unit area. That would be the solar constant. Or the latitude where the forest is located or where the plant is located, the cloudiness of the area, the amount of dust and the amount of water that are present in the atmosphere, what is the leaf arrangement of the plant, what is the area per leaf of the plant, and what is the concentration of carbon dioxide and the nutrients. So as you might be able to guess, how these different things affect is like solar constant. If there's a high solar constant, means a high amount of sunlight is reaching per unit area of the earth, then that will enhance the productivity of that area. So that is why forests that are found near the areas with high amount of sunlight have high biomass. Latitude, if you look at the latitude, because sunlight amount of sunlight is higher near the equator, and it decreases as you go towards the pole on either side. So you see that as the latitude increases, the solar constant would kind of decrease. So latitude, again, depending on the amount of sunlight that is received. At near the equator, if there's a forest present, then that will have a higher amount of biomass, and as you move further away, the biomass will start decreasing. Cloudiness, if there's more amount of clouds, that means a lot of the sunlight will get reflected back, and that will decrease the productivity of plants on that particular day. If there's a lot of dust and water in the atmosphere, that will also lead to a lot of scattering of light and a lot of reflection back of the sunlight, again leading to um, uh, decrease in the productivity. Then leaf arrangement and leaf area. Some plants or most plants try to maximize the amount of sunlight they receive by arranging their leaves in such a way so that there's a lot less overlap, and even the leaves which are at the lower levels get equal amount of sunlight as the leaves on the higher levels. So the arrangement of the leaves in the plants leads to or can affect productivity. If there's a lot of overlap between the leaves, then the productivity will be lower. But if they're arranged in such a way that all of them receive an equal amount of sunlight, more or less, then the productivity will be higher for such a plant. Area of the leaf, plants which have a bigger leaves or huge area, then they will have higher productivity compared to plants with very small leaves. And then concentration of carbon dioxide and nutrients. If there's high carbon dioxide, high nutrients, then of course productivity will be higher because there's a lot more carbon dioxide available for the plant to fix, right? So these are different factors that affect the productivity. Now, when we talk about different nutrients that are required for plant growth, there are two major categories in which nutrients can be divided. When we're talking about plant growth, there is macronutrients and there are micronutrients. Macronutrients, as the term suggests, are nutrients that are required in higher quantities, and micronutrients are nutrients that are required in trace amounts or very little amounts, right? And primary nutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Secondary nutrients or secondary macronutrients are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And micronutrients, as I said, that are needed in small amounts. And as this image shows, some examples of micronutrients could be boron, copper, iron, chloride, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. So apart from these general things of light, carbon dioxide, water, and soil, these nutrients are very essential. Some of these are essential nutrients, which actually would be nutrients without which the plant cannot sustain itself. And nutrients, if in the absence of them, you cannot actually provide them a substitute. If there's no nitrogen present, you cannot provide some other nutrient to the plant, and it cannot like just substitute that and use the other one instead of nitrogen. So these are some nutrients which themselves are required in specific quantities for the plant to be able to sustain itself. They cannot be just swapped out by different other nutrients, right? So these are some essential elements required for plant growth. Then coming to biogeochemical cycles, you might already be aware about this. This is taught in high school as well, even in the UG courses. Biogeochemical cycles are basically the cycling of nutrients or cycling of chemicals through biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. So, like you can see in this general diagram, Sunlight is giving in sunlight is giving in some incident radiation, and then there are these nutrients that are that are getting taken up by the plant, or the plant is absorbing them from the soil, and also from the minerals and the water that comes from the rocks, the bedrock. So that comes up into the soil, and these are then taken up by the plant. These nutrients, via respiration, uh, via photosynthesis, the plant fixes them in its own system. And these are then taken up by the consumers, which could be primary consumers or secondary consumers, which could also be another level. For example, this ungulate or this cattle is being hunted by a carnivore, then that would be a secondary consumer. So basically, the heterotrophs, they consume these resources or these nutrients from the autotrophs. And then when these things die, for example, the leaves of the plant, they shed off, or when this consumer will die off, or from the or when this consumer will when there'll be feces, these different things, there'll be nutrients even in those things which the decomposers will act on. And the decomposers have a very important role, because they will release back the nutrients which have been fixed in the plant tissue and in the animal tissue. These fixed nutrients will then be released back into the environment by the action of the decomposers. Okay, so that's a very general biogeochemical cycle which can be applied to different chemicals and different nutrients. For example, carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, all of these are cycled through the environment or through the earth, because earth or anywhere, there's no like unlimited amount of resources. All of the resources that we have are limited by some way or the another. And in most of these cycles, these resources get recycled through different plant abiotic and biotic you know uh, elements or components, and then they keep on sustaining the forests or sustaining life basically. So that is all about biogeochemical cycles. And the next lecture talked about ecological succession, which was actually the last lecture of the week, in which we talked about ecological succession. You might already be aware there is some rocks which get covered by lichens, then come mosses, grasses, herbs, shrubs, which we'll be discussing a little bit in detail in the further slides. So, when you talk about ecological succession, a very basic definition, or as given by Wikipedia, it's basically the process of change in the species structure of an ecological community over time. So it's a process, it's a mechanism that happens over time, and it leads to a change in the species structure of a particular place. So if you have a particular area in which there's just barren rock, then how the different species come and colonize that area and get replaced by different species over time. That's basically what is ecological succession. And this time scale that which we're talking about can range from decades. For example, after a wildfire, which would be a kind of an example of a secondary ecological succession, to a little bit more or a little bit less, or a lot more or a lot less, based on what kind of succession and what kind of plant species and area we're talking about. So, ecological succession is a process of change in species structure of a community over time. So, when we're talking about this, when there's any succession, that any ecological succession, there's first community A, which would be a pioneer community, which is the first community that comes and occupies that area after that area has been made barren. It could either be barren, for example, if there was a wildfire in a forest and now there's no trees left. That kind of a barren, like because it got affected, or it could be because it's newly formed. For example, there was a volcanic eruption and the lava flowed, and then the rock formed. That could be a second form of a barren land formation, basically. So first comes the pioneers community or the pioneer species. Then eventually you move on to serial species, which are the ones that come in stages till the pioneer species reaches the climax stage, so which is the stabilized community. So there's a pioneer community, which is the first set of species that occupy that land. Then comes in different species until we reach a climax community, which is the stable community, which is very little affected after that. It's not like replaced by another communities, right? So when we talk about pioneer species, as I said, it's the first species to invade a barren area. So it's the first species that is going to invade a barren area. And as it might already be, I don't know, clear or obvious that it's going to be a hardy species, because when you're talking about a barren area, it means there's no soil, there's no nutrients readily available to support the plants. So it's supposed to be a hardy species which can get established in a disrupted ecosystem and will then trigger some ecological succession in that area. And based on this, there are some characteristics of pioneer species, which we're going to be talking about. So, do you guys want to take a guess on what could be some of these characteristics of pioneer species? So, as I said, it's supposed to be a very hardy species which can invade a barren area and then establish itself and then further trigger ecological succession. So, what would be some characteristics for a species to be able to do that? Yeah, it should be capable of growing on bare rocks. Correct. So if you're talking about, if you're talking about a community which is being established in bare rocks, then yes, it should have the capability of grow on a bare rock, or it could be nutrient poor soil, or it could be to be able to grow in water with or very low nutrient water. Should be able to tolerate extreme conditions. Very good. Should be able to tolerate conditions that are too extreme for other species to establish, very hot or very cold. Should have a short lifetime. Correct, because there's it's mostly, first of all, there should be, yeah, because there's these species are going to get replaced by other species. They should have, or and also because there's not a lot of nutrients, they should have a short lifespan. If they have a very long lifespan, means they will require a lot more nutrients to establish themselves. But because they if they are short lifespan species, they'll be able to sustain on low nutrients. And because the nutrients available in this barren area are very little, it should have a low requirement for nutrients. Mostly it will be an autotroph, because if it's a heterotroph, which means it depends on something else, that would mean that there should already have been that something else available for it to be able to sustain itself. Very nice. All of these are correct. Low nutritional requirements, small size, ability to disperse through spore or seeds. So these are certain characteristics of pioneer species. It should be able to grow on this barren rock, a very nutrient poor area, should be able to tolerate extreme conditions, has low nutritional requirements, as I said, because this barren rock will not have a lot of nutrients because it's impenetrable. This species need to act on the rock and probably break it a little bit for it to become, for the nutrients to be available for the next sort of a species. And the species is more or less small in size because it has to establish on this area which does not have a lot of, if it's a rock, then it does not have a lot of support. There's no place to put your roots in. So you need to be small in size to be able to establish there. And they have a short lifespan and rapid growth. They can grow rapidly, but the lifespan is still short. And they can disperse easily through spores and seeds, which means that this particular pioneer species, or like the community, the different species that form pioneer communities, they should be able to grow via spores or seeds, and these seeds should be produced in large quantities so that they can spread far and wide and actually reach the barren area. If these don't if they require certain particular planting by people or by say seed dispersers, then it will be difficult for it to establish in a barren area, because who is going to go and spread the seeds there? So it needs to be able to proliferate either by spores, because then they can be carried by water or by wind. So that is a reason that it needs to be able to produce these seeds in large quantities so that they can reach the barren area first of all. Then, from the pioneer, let's talk about the climax community. Climax community, as we discussed, are basically the community that forms in the last stage of ecological succession. These are communities consisting of plants, animals, and fungi that are formed over time by ecological succession in an area. So, when an area has undergone ecological succession over time, the last stage will be the climax community, and it is said to have reached steady state, that not very small changes cannot really impact this community. But yeah, of course, if there's a very large effect, for example, there's a flooding of the area or there's a fire, then it will be affected. Otherwise, it will not be affected by small changes in that area. Right? And there are four types of climax communities. One of them is called climatic community or climatic climax, which, as the term suggests, the climax is dependent on the climate of the area. So, what kind of a climate that area has, that controls what kind of a climax uh, that area is going to reach, or that community is going to reach. Then there is edaphic climax. Basically, that is the kind of climax community which is controlled by the soil type or the soil conditions of the region. So how what kind of a soil is found in that region, that basically controls this climax. So that's called edaphic. Then there's catastrophic climax, which is basically controlled by catastrophic events, like I said, for example, like a wildfire. If that affects the climax community, then that's called a catastrophic climax. And then there's something called a disclimax, which means that this kind of a climax community is being controlled either by some or the other disturbance. For example, it could be a human disturbance, or it could be a disturbance by cattle grazing or things like that, like animals or humans and different interactions, and that will cause a disclimax. So there are four kinds of climax communities. Moving on to the characteristics of climax community. So, like we discussed, characteristics of pioneer species. Similarly, there are some characteristics of the climax community. This vegetation is tolerant of the environment condition of that particular area. So, this vegetation is not cannot handle extreme climates, but it can handle the climate of that area in which it has established itself. So it will not be able to, like, you cannot suddenly put it in a climate where it's not adjusted to that climate. It is adjusted to a certain particular climatic regime where it's established, so it's tolerant of that climate or environmental condition. There's a high species diversity. There will be a lot of different species present in the climax community because there's a high amount of biodiversity. If you leave it alone, if there's not human interruption, then there's be a high amount of biodiversity in the area. Food chains here will be complex because now you have a lot of different biodiversity, a lot of different plants established in the area. The food chains will be complex. So on the plants will feed certain herbivores, and the herbivores will feed secondary consumers or carnivores, and there'll be apex predators, things like that. So there'll be a very complex food webs in this climax community. So when you're talking about community, it does not just include of plants. It also includes animals, insects, all of these secondary consumers, and that's why you're talking about a community and not just a species or a particular taxa, right? It has a well formed spatial structure. So, by the time a community reaches the climax, the spatial structure of that area becomes quite well formed. There's, like, as we discussed, like in a forest, there'll be these different well formed layers. There'll be forest floor, understory, canopy, emergent layer. So, like that, there'll be some spatial structure of that community. And there's going to be an equilibrium between gross production and respiration, and a kind of an equilibrium between uptake and release of nutrients. So when something has reached a climax, it will, as we said, steady state. So the amount of nutrients that it takes up and the amount of nutrient it releases will be more or less balanced. So it will be able to sustain itself. There's not going to be like a lot of change or a lot of impact of these things on the uh, community. And then the species compositions, as I said, they will be unchanged over long periods of time because a climax community is not very easily affected by smaller changes in the environment. So the species composition remains to be unchanged over a long amount of time. And these communities are good indicators of climate and other conditions of the area. So if you have an area where a particular community has reached climax or steady state, it can be a very good bioindicator, because now if you start seeing changes in that area, if you start seeing that some species are getting certainly decreasing in numbers or some species are going extinct, then you can actually start looking at what conditions have changed in the area, what trees maybe have affected. Is it because of increased temperature? Is it because of increased amount of rainfall, even more frequent flooding, things like that? So they are very good indicators of how climate might be affecting that area, right? Coming to the serial stages, as we said, between the pioneer and the climax community come in these different serial stages, which are the rolling stages which keep changing in ecological succession. So, the intermediate stage found in ecological succession in an ecosystem which is going towards climax. So, pioneer has come and established. then the intermediate stages that you find there in an ecosystem which is now moving towards a climax. And these serial stage communities, they consist of vegetations that are adapted to that site's particular physical and biotic conditions. So even in the serial stage, in these communities, the vegetation types will be more or less adapted to that particular site, to the conditions found in that particular site. And physical and biotic conditions, mostly the local equilibria, so they'll be very well adjusted to the local conditions. Okay. And different types of serial stages are found in ecological succession. Some of these, one of them is hydrosphere. As the term suggests, hydro meaning water. So hydrosphere is basically in an area where the succession has started with the area succession has started with plenty of water. So hydrosphere will be the stages in the ecological succession in an area which started with a lot of water. Example would be ponds, lakes, swamps, streams. So when ecological succession happens in such places like ponds and lakes, that is called a hydrosphere, or that community is called a hydrosphere. Hallosphere, which means that it started in an area with saline water, for example, marshes. So if the water or if the community has high amount of salt, then that's basically a hallosphere. Then there's xerosphere, which starts with minimal amount of water, so which means it's mostly land, kind of a deal, which starts in an area with less amount of water. It could be lithosphere or samosphere. Lithosphere, it starts in a barren rock, for example, volcanic rock, and samosphere is mostly related to sand. So if the ecological succession is starting in an area which has newly exposed coastal lands or coastal sands like sand dunes, that could be a samosphere. For example, say in a certain area, the sea is no longer um, coming as close, and there's some amount of sand that's gotten exposed, or some land has formed, or maybe because of tectonic plate movement some land has actually come risen up on the surface, uh, and is higher now than the sea level. Then that is newly exposed, and that will lead to some sort of a samosphere condition. Now coming to primary succession, as I said, you can see in this image there is bare rock. This barren rock might have formed by volcanic activity. Then this rock will be colonized by lichens. First will come the crustose lichen, which form like a crust, like a layer on the rock. Then there'll be foliose lichen, which are a little bit like a leaf structure. They have a little bit structure to them. They look like leaves on the rock. So there'll be crustose and foliose lichen. These things will act on the rock. They will release chemicals. They'll release nutrients from the rock. They'll break down the rock, and then eventually it'll become broken down so much so as to be able to support mosses. Once mosses come in, then small, like there's small annual plants and lichens, these things will come in. Even animals will start coming in, which can feed on these mosses. So animals or insects, for example, first will be able to colonize that area. Eventually, it will lead to small plants, small lichens. Then it will lead to grasses or perennial species, which do not need to have a short lifespan. Now they can have like a longer lifespan. So grasses and perennials will come in. Then eventually you'll find intermediate species, which include a lot of shrubs and shade tolerance and bigger trees and things like that. And then you'll have a climax community, which, as we discussed, will be the steady state community for that area. So this is an example of primary succession. And as we discussed, primary succession starts in a place which does not even have soil. It starts in a place which has rock, barren rock. So can be on sides of volcanoes, because if they erupt, then there'll be new layer of lava which solidifies and forms barren rock. Or glacier recession, so if there's a particular area with a lot of glaciers, and if that glacier moves or if that melts, then that um, rock will get exposed, and that will lead to some amount of primary succession over time. It starts with the arrival of living things such as lichens that do not need soil to survive, or starts with the arrival of pioneer species, as we discussed. So they do not need soil to sustain themselves, they can just survive on rocks. Then the pioneer species will lead to the weathering of rocks and will trigger ecological succession, as we discussed, leads to the formation of soil and decomposition of species, adds nutrients for successive communities to occupy the area. So it will lead to, now because these pioneer species are causing the weathering of the rocks, they're causing the rocks to break down, then eventually soil will form. And the species that also were there and are dying, and their biomass is getting accommodated in the area, is getting included in the area, adds nutrients for other species to occupy, right? And it's mostly slower than secondary succession because it starts from bare rock. Then you come to secondary succession. As discussed, it starts by some sort of a disturbance. So, for example, there was a forest, but then a forest fire happened, and now that area is completely fallow. There's no species left there. Everything is burnt to the ground. Then you see that now pioneer species come here. But because this is not starting from rock, this is starting from some sort of a soil is already present there on which the earlier species were there. So the colonization here is a little bit more easier, and so it starts with not lichens but like more smaller grasses. Then eventually there is bigger grasses and perennials. Then you have the intermediate species, and then you have again the climax community. So it's a little bit faster than the primary succession. Secondary succession begins in a place that already has soil, was once a home of living organisms, occurs after all plant life has been destroyed, but the soil is still intact. Habitat got disturbed by events like fires or floods or winds or logging by humans. Pioneer species do not occur on bare rock but pre existing soil, occurs faster, and has different pioneer species than primary succession. So, important thing to keep in mind, occurs faster and has different pioneer species than primary succession, and it does not start on the barren rock, right? Then there's the third thing, which is called a cyclical succession. It's basically periodic changes arising from fluctuating species interactions or recurring events. So even in a secondary succession, it was a chance event. Okay, a forest fire happened, and now again a climax community can exist. But in the case of cyclic succession, these changes keep happening again and again. They're periodic changes, and they keep happening either because of interactions or because of some sort of a recurring event. For example, here you can see that there's a tree. Eventually, this tree dies and falls down. Then there will be open areas without canopy. Then these open areas will become into thickets or shrubs. And then, if the grazers don't consume this, again a seedling will grow into another tree. So this is a very simple, small example of cyclical succession. But if you think about, say, a forest which is regularly logged, you can think about it in that sense. It's regularly being logged. It's logged. There's no trees left. Then there will be formed thickets. Then trees will come again, and then say somebody comes again and logs it once more. So that's also a kind of a cyclical succession, right? Now I have this short quiz designed for you guys, in which we will read each description and we will decide whether it is primary succession or secondary succession. So, first one says there's an old house which was torn down. Small plants and grasses grew in a vacant lot. Over the next few years, bushes and tree seedlings began to grow. So, is this an example of a primary succession or a secondary succession? You can either unmute yourselves or you can type it out in the chat box. Anything works. So, what do you think? Is this an example of a primary succession or a secondary succession? Okay, you're saying primary succession. Um, why? Would you like to provide a reasoning behind your answer? And anybody else who would also like to take a guess at this one? There's an old house which is torn down. Small plants and grasses grow in the vacant lot. Maybe there has been a forest before the house was built. Okay, so why is it primary succession if there has been a forest before the house was built? And here they're saying that there was a house and the house got torn down, and now the lot is vacant. There's no house standing there, and there's like fallow ground, and now there are small plants that are growing there, and eventually trees and bushes start growing. So why would that be a primary succession? And anybody else who would also like to take a guess at this or take a go? So everybody thinks that it should be primary succession. Okay, anyway, but so the answer to this is actually secondary succession, since we're talking about an area which already has, yeah, it is secondary succession, since you're talking about a land where already there is land, there is soil, there was a house there, and now that house just got torn down, and so there's no house anymore, but that land is still there. So we're not talking about an area where there is barren rock. We're talking about some place where there's already ground and there's soil there, and then the plants and trees are occupying that. So that is an example of secondary succession. Next question is, or next example is, an undersea volcano erupted and formed a small island. Mosses and lichens begin to grow on the bare volcanic rock. This is an example of primary or secondary succession. What do you think? Guys, it would be really nice if others of you could also interact in the class, because then we could have like a nice discussion about things and maybe some concepts would be clearer. Yes, this would be an example of a primary succession, because very clearly in this example, we're talking about, okay, a volcano erupted under sea and a small island has formed now, which means there's nothing but the solidified lava there. So it's not going to be any soil. And mosses and lichens are the pioneer species, and of course, on bare rock. So it's an example of primary succession. Now we're talking about a logging company cuts down all the large spruce trees in an area of forest. After the area was cleared, spruce seedlings began to sprout and animals returned to the area. Is this an example of primary or secondary succession? So there was a forest which was cut down by the logging company, and after they left, after a certain amount of time, the area was seedlings came again, and the animals started to return. Cyclic succession. It could be cyclic succession, but since here we're not talking about the logging company coming again and again and destroying the forest again once it becomes a spruce forest. So here we're only discussing primary and secondary, so it would be a secondary succession. But yes, if it's happening again and again, if the logging company comes back again after the spruce trees have developed, have gotten fully mature, and then again this happens, then it will definitely be a cyclic succession. Next example, a wildfire broke out across the California area and continued to spread for several days. As a result, many plants and crops were destroyed, and animals were forced to find new shelter. So, what happened here? A wildfire broke out and it continued to spread. Many plants and crops are destroyed, and animals then went away. So, what will happen here? Will it be an example of primary or a secondary succession? If trees start growing again in this area and animals return. So this will be an example of secondary succession, because as we discussed, okay, a wildfire has happened, but actually there was a forest earlier. Yeah, it is secondary succession. There was a forest earlier, but now a wildfire happened and nothing survives anymore. But again, if trees come in this area, it will be a secondary succession. And the last one is that a glacier has retreated and it leaves behind gravel deposits called moraine. The youngest moraines are populated by bacteria and fungi and will soon become lichens. So, is this an example of primary or secondary succession? So this would be an example of actually primary succession, because as we discussed, now there is nothing but gravel deposits left behind, and because they're getting populated by bacteria and fungi, which is the pioneer communities, it's actually primary succession. So because we're starting with an area which does not already have soil. Okay, moving on to what are the different mechanisms behind ecological succession. So, according to Clements, ecological succession occurs actually in 5 steps. Number one is nudation. Nudation is the process where the land is made barren. So, either in case of secondary successions, the land was made barren either by logging or by wildfires or by flooding, because all the trees in that area now died. Or in the case of primary succession, the land is made bare because the land is made, it's getting formed, because the volcano erupted and the lava solidified, so the land has formed. So that's how the barren land comes into being. So that's nudation. Then there is migration or invasion, basically processes by which different species are migrating into the area or they're invading the area. For example, the spores of these lichens that we talked about, the crustose lichens, or these different bacteria, fungi, spores of these species, they migrate into the area, they invade the area, right? Then next is echesis. Echesis is a process by which these spores that have come into the area get established into the area. Invading an area versus getting established and sustaining in that area are two different things. So one is by they invade the area, and the second process in which they get established in this area now. Then there is aggregation. So this area starts seeing some aggregations of the species that have actually now established themselves, and eventually there'll be competition. So these different species that have come together in this area will compete, and eventually the stronger one will outcompete the previous community. So, for example, in the cereal stages, if you have lichens earlier, now because the lichens have broken down the rock into a little bit smaller particles, and some amount of soil is there, some amount of decomposed matter is there. Now, bigger uh, plants like mosses or grasses can um establish themselves in the area, and they will overpower the lichens, and now that area will have the newer community, which is the mosses. And then after the mosses die out, eventually the grasses will establish, because they can take over or they can compete the mosses out of that area, so there'll be competition. Actually, it's going to be 7 steps. Then there's going to be some reaction. So because of these different species being together and how they're affecting the area, so because the lichens had some sort of a reaction on the rock, they broke down the rock into soil, and then eventually the grasses will have some more reaction, they'll break it down further and they'll increase. Okay, I lost my internet connection. Hi. uh, am I audible? I think I had lost my internet connection for a bit. Okay, I hope I'm audible. So I was talking about that eventually there's some sort of a reaction that that lichen had on the rock, and that eventually the grasses will have on that on the soils. They'll increase the amount of fertility of the soil. There'll be more decomposed matter in the soil. So that's the reaction they have on the community, and then eventually there's stabilization. So when we talk about the climax community, eventually all the trees, all the plant community, animal community will have reached a stable equilibria, which is not really affected by the small external factors. So these are our 7 stages in ecological succession. Then there are the last concept that was discussed during this week were the theories of climax. There are 3 theories of climax that have been put forth. As you, if you've watched the lectures, you would be aware there is monoclimax theory, which was given by Clements in 1916. There's polyclimax by Tansley in 1935, and climax pattern by Whitaker in 1953. So, would you guys want to take a guess on what is monoclimax, polyclimax, and climax pattern? Even one line explanations are enough. Just give me a rough idea of what you think is monoclimax, what did that theory talk about, and then what was polyclimax and what was climax pattern. After this, we'll move on to the quiz for this session, and then we'll wrap up. So does anybody have an idea on what is the monoclimax theory talks about? Yeah, very nice. So basically, in monoclimax, Clemens basically said that there is only one climax. So only one climax community can be formed, and it is entirely dependent on the climate of the area. Then Tansley said later in polyclimax theory that okay, that's not true. There can be different types of climaxes or different types of climax communities that can be formed in a particular area, and even though they are dependent on the climate, but they're also dependent on the different soil features of the area, the topography of the area, the amount of rainfall that that area receives. So it's controlled by different factors and not just the climate. So according to the monoclimax theory, this is solely dependent on climate. In polyclimax, it says it's not just climate, it's the soil factors, which means the edaphic factors, and the topography, if it's the sloping land or if it's a flat land and things like that, or if there's a lot of fires in that area and things like that. And then came the climax pattern by Whitaker, who says that the climax community structure, even though it's not controlled by a single factor, even though yes, climate could be the major controller or there could be the major determinant of what kind of a climax community is getting formed, but there's still this climax community keeps on changing with the local factors of the area. Okay, so it is not dependent on a single factor. There is absolutely no single climax in any area. Different climax communities can be reached based on what kind of plant interactions are happening in the area and what plants invaded and formed, uh, or invaded and set and established in that particular area. So this was all that was talked about during the lectures, and now I have a short quiz series for you guys. So yeah, let's discuss that. So the first question of the quiz, I hope you understood the different concepts that were discussed during the lectures and what I explained today. If you have any doubts, you can stop me anytime and ask me your doubts. And yeah, my first question in the quiz is: lithosphere is an example of hydrosphere, xerosphere, thermosphere, or halosphere? Xerosphere, correct. We just discussed in the serial communities that lithosphere is an example of xerosphere where the succession starts on barren rock. Now, the next question is a little bit longer to read, but which of these depicts correctly the lithosphere primary succession? So, if you're talking about a lithosphere primary succession, which of these correctly shows that? So, from a rock to foliose lichen to crustose lichen to moss, herbaceous stage, shrub, woodland climax. Yeah. So, or is there, okay. A lot of people are saying A is the answer. A has rock, foliose lichen, crustose lichen, moss, herbaceous, wood, oh, shrub, wood, and climax. Then C has rock, crustose lichen, foliose lichen, moss, herbaceous. So everything is the same. The only difference in these two is crustose lichen and foliose lichen. So can you tell me which one comes earlier? Is it crustose lichen or is it foliose lichen? That will decide whether A is the answer. Yeah. So the answer to this question is actually C. So basically, crustose lichen comes before foliose lichen. Next question is: at the compensation point, which of this is true? Is photosynthesis equal to respiration, more than respiration, less than respiration, or none of the above? Correct. Very nice. So you all know that at the compensation point, photosynthesis becomes equal to respiration. Next is the study of life history or general features of forest crops with respect to the environment factors is called what? Foresticulture, monoculture, silviculture, or silvics. So, what is the study of life history of forest crops? Very good. So, the study of forest cultures is actually silvics. Silvics is what goes behind silviculture. Nice. So, the next question is: a climax caused by wildfires is an example of climax, edaphic climax, disclimax, or catastrophic climax? Okay, a lot of you are saying C for this question. Are you sure? A climax community caused by wildfires is an example of. Is it an example of disclimax? Yeah. So correct. So it's an example of actually a catastrophic climax because we're talking about a catastrophic event like a wildfire. If it was disclimax, it would have been some human intervention or some animal's impact, right? So, not really wild, not disclimax for this question. Next question is net primary productivity is given by APAR plus LUE, APAR into LUE, minus LUE, or divided by LUE. So, what is net primary productivity? What is the formula? Very good. So, what we talked about, net primary productivity is actually APAR multiplied by LUE. It is the absorbed photosynthetically active radiation and the light use efficiency of the plants. Nice. Next question is practical application of scientific, technical, economic principles of forestry comes under which branch? Is it management, economics, mensuration, or protection? Very nice. So the correct answer is forest management. Forest management is the practical application of scientific, technical, and economic principles. In the context of plant nutrition, boron is a macronutrient, a micronutrient, a primary nutrient, or a secondary nutrient. Nice, very good. So, if you're talking about plant nutrition, boron is a micronutrient. It's not required in very high quantity for it to be a macronutrient. Which of these is not a characteristic of pioneer species? Ability to grow on bare rocks, ability to tolerate extreme temperatures, a large size, or a short lifespan. Correct. So, the correct answer is a large size because they cannot establish themselves if they have a large size on bare rocks. So, they need to be smaller in size. So there's a climax community near Tindini village. It is being controlled by disturbance by cattle. Is this an example of climatic, edaphic disclimax, or catastrophic climax? Okay, have you guys already answered this? One second. Yeah. So what is the answer to this question? The Yeah. Very nice. So this will be an example of disclimax because it's being controlled by disturbance by cattle in that area. So that's why this is not edaphic, it's not climatic, it's not dependent on soil conditions or climate conditions or like a wildfire or a flood. It's being controlled by some cattle of the area. So that's why it's a disclimax. Very good. Which of the following is a pioneer species in ecological succession? Teak, sal, lichens, or wood? Or oak, sorry. Teak, sal, lichens, or oak. Which of these is a pioneer species? Yeah. Very good. As we discussed, lichens is a pioneer species, and mostly it's the crustose lichens that comes before the foliose lichens. Secondary succession differs from primary succession because it occurs faster. It starts without soil. It begins with lichens. It occurs only in forests. So, how is secondary succession different from primary succession? So, which of these is the features of secondary succession and not very good? It basically occurs faster than primary succession. So, A is the correct answer. Primary objective of silviculture is to maximize wildlife population, to improve aesthetic value of forests, to control the establishment, growth, and composition of forests, or to prevent forest fires. What is the uh, primary objective of silviculture? You guys are correct. The primary objective is to control the establishment, growth, and composition of forests. Which nutrient is a macronutrient essential for plant growth? Iron, zinc, nitrogen, or copper? Which of these is essential for plant growth? Yeah, so the correct answer is C. Nitrogen is essential for plant growth. And then we talk about why is nitrogen essential for plant growth. So it is, but why is it important? Is it because it's a component of cell wall, or because it's a component of chlorophyll and proteins, or because it's present in root hair, or because it's like important for stomata? Yeah, so the correct answer is because nitrogen is a primary component of chlorophyll and proteins. And now I'll give you a little bit about the nutrients and their function. Nitrogen, as we discussed, is a constituent of chlorophyll, proteins, nucleic acids, vitamins, and hormones. Phosphorus is a constituent of nucleic acids. Again, ATP, as you know, adenosine triphosphate. So it's present in ATP, which is the energy molecule, in cell membranes and in some proteins. Then there's potassium. Potassium, as we know, is important for cation ion balance because there's sodium potassium channels there. It's required for maintaining the turgidity of the cell and so when it comes to cell turgidity in plants, it's important for opening and closing of stomata, and it's important for activating certain enzymes. Calcium is a cell wall constituent, and calcium channels are present in the membranes, and it's required for activating enzymes. Magnesium is a constituent of chlorophyll again, and then it's required for the activation of the respiration enzyme. And then there's sulfur. Sulfur is the constituent of cysteine and methionine. These are the two amino acids, and it's also a component of many vitamins and coenzymes. Okay, so here in this slide, I'm basically talking about the function of the macronutrients, the three primary and the three secondary nutrients. Okay, moving on to the next question. Decomposers are important in nutrient cycles because they produce organic matter, or they fix atmospheric nitrogen, they release nutrients back into the soil, or they prevent nutrient loss. So, why are decomposers important in nutrient cycles? We just discussed this in the biogeochemical cycle slide. Yeah, you're all correct. They're basically required for releasing nutrients back into the soil. Which element is a major component of ATP and nucleic acids in plants? We just discussed this. Potassium, calcium, phosphorus, or magnesium. Which of these is a major component of ATP and nucleic acids? Correct. So this was the last question, I think. And the correct answer is phosphorus. Thank you so much for attending this tutorial session. I hope it was helpful to you guys. I hope the concepts are clear now. If anybody has any doubts, you can ask me. And if there are no doubts, thank you for attending. You can leave this meeting. Thank you. If anybody has any doubts, you can either type them out in the chat box or just unmute yourself and ask me. If there's no doubts, should I end the meeting now? Okay. Okay, thank you for attending. See you next week.